So here we go, right?
Here we
Guest
go.
officially guest number two, uh,
Indeed,
and I'm pumped. Soren, you're gonna hear about this for the first time right now, but you have a nickname.
I do.
You do.
Okay.
The
And what
Dos
would that
Equis,
be?
the Dos Equis guy,
Oh, Lord.
the most interesting man in Kentucky.
You are definitely playing up a card that you don't necessarily have to play.
Well, I was explaining to Russ. We wanted to get a couple of guests on that we both know, and before we start reaching out, to people we don't know, we wanted to see what it feels like to jointly process an interview or to work through processing an interview. And when I mentioned you to Russ, I said he's the Dos Equis guy. Like his background is as interesting as anyone that I know personally, and so we thought it would be a lot of fun to talk with you. Hopefully, more than once.
Well, thank you for the vote of confidence. I hope to live up to the expectation. Let's put it that way.
So
So,
what we try to do is just, I mean, we're just having conversation. It's not like a formal interview. So if we get in the
sure.
weeds, just go, go
Okay.
in the
All
weeds.
right. All right.
Dogs or cats? Favorite color? What's your middle name?
Yeah,
We're going to avoid this.
Okay.
yeah.
I got one of
Well,
those.
how?
It happens to be, by the way, it happens to be Sorin, is my middle name. My actual official first name is Alexandru, but no one that knows me directly calls me by Alexandru. It's everybody that knows me calls me Sorin. So
So was that a function of the parents? The
blame my
parents.
mom. She
Okay.
wanted she wanted that name. I guess she got it. So
Yeah. So as I understand it, you just returned from Romania,
I did.
where you're from. Do you enjoy going back? Obviously, family's there.
I do, and I really enjoy. One of the things about life is obviously the sadness of having your parents age, but at the same time, that's a joy. So my mom is 87. I go and visit as often as I can, and obviously, the line of work in which I am right now allows me to do that a little bit easier than what it would mean to buy a ticket every time. So I try to go there every couple of months, maybe 3 to 4, and at more challenging times. But yeah, I travel there quite often. So
So how is it when you go back now, in terms of, obviously you grew up there, so you have the perspective of having been there at that time. How is it when you go back now? Does it feel like it's the same place? Does it feel like it's changed tremendously? What is your impression on the evolution of the culture of Romania? Obviously, a lot has changed, um, from a system of government standpoint, but like, from your perspective, how has it changed? How has it evolved?
tremendous changes, of course. One of the most defining factors of the changes are the openness. The society is much more open now. It has not only from the press standpoint, but also from the accessibility of things, material things in general, and for example, even construction specifics you can think of. It's available for anyone to do whatever they please. The the other side of that is that it's not necessarily the same as if it were to be talking about. I'm sorry. It's not the same as if we were to be talking about the open society in the United States. There are obviously cultural differences, and Europe in general has that feature about it. So each country's particulars can be identified. You can identify the country by how it works. You can look at Hungary, you can look at the Czech Republic, you can look at France, you can look at Germany, and openness looks slightly different in all of those. And that's what's happening in Romania as well. Now, generically speaking, way different than the past, much more open. But there are also cultural things that make you stop a little bit and analyze How do you interact with elders? How do you raise children? All those things are probably a little peculiar to the Western mindset, if that makes any sense.
In
But they're
what
still
sense?
there.
Yeah, in what sense is it different than the Western mindset in your impression, in your opinion?
Traditions. The
Mm.
first thing that comes to mind is traditions. Um, there are ways in which family works a certain established way. Are there boundaries that are broken in that regard? Yes. But there's still expectations that, for example, children respect their parents, respect certain types of authority. There is a way to be good and to be bad. And the typical ways in which in the West we think of somebody being bad would probably be atrocities over there, if that makes any sense. Now, do you see that happening? Yes. I think the influence of the world in general will affect the country in that regard. But there's still vestiges of more traditional ways of living, if that makes sense. So they're present even today in Romania. You will probably see similar things. I've just read an article on Hungary just recently, and one of the efforts that that particular government seems to be doing nowadays is to reset or maybe strengthen old ways of being in society, family, preloading systems of welfare for a child before they reach, let's say, adulthood, things of that sort. And you'll find some of that in Romania as well,
You
probably
know
because
what?
of the tradition.
And I'm stepping on Russ's time here. I apologize, but one of the what you just mentioned it makes me think about one of Nixon's proposed big initiatives. Nixon, our president, obviously a very conservative or viewed as a conservative president. He was actually the originator of the proposal to deposit $5,000 for every child born in the U.S. into a retirement account for them that they can get on uh, reaching age 21, I believe, or maybe it was 18, or maybe it was full fledged retirement. I don't remember the increment of time, but he was the first. Seems like a very what we would consider a traditionally liberal position, but that was actually Richard Nixon's proposal, which I think is interesting. I think, and maybe we'll come back to that. I'll turn it over to Russ, but I think that's a really interesting point of from a policy standpoint. We talked about policies a couple of weeks back, but from a policy standpoint, um, how do you assign things of value and benefit to children born in the U.S. without that will whether it's retirement or education funds, things that thinking about the welfare and the benefit of that kid or that child at the time of birth as opposed to somewhere down the line, I think is an interesting policy concept.
It is a huge question. So, but anyway, Russ.
Yes.
I want to know. So tell me. Do you have tell everybody a little bit about? You said you can get back home more easily in this line of work, and Terry says you're the most interesting man in the world. What's the most interesting man in the world line of work right now?
I fly airplanes.
Big ones, little ones,
big ones. Yes.
And how long have you been doing that?
Between a variety of them, not by choice, but I've flown a number of them from big to small, commercially and professionally, of course. And that's been going on for 27 years now.
Okay, so in the last 2.5 decades, what's changed more, flying or Romania?
I wish I could give you a very specific yes or no, black and white type of answer, but I can't. They both changed in very radical ways. Romania has changed from being one of the satellite states. It was never part of the Soviet Union, but it was one of the satellite states, the so-called Warsaw Pact. Aviation has changed probably similarly radically, if that makes sense. Um, how has aviation changed? That's, let me count the ways.
Let me count the ways. What's the give me a positive change and a negative change from 2 decades of aviation?
a positive way. Technology has increased the availability of airspace, for example, and also the precision with which airplanes can be flown, probably by leaps and bounds, technology-wise. So that would probably fall under the category of a good thing. Bad thing, I think some of the old skills are diminishing or decaying. Not that they are all needed at the same time, but there's a common phrase in aviation called situational awareness. The situational awareness is basically a mental construct that you have to continuously maintain, not just build, but continuously maintain as life. Sorry, I apologize.
It's awesome.
The situational awareness you have to continuously maintain and update and keep active. The more complex an endeavor becomes, such as flying an airplane and getting all worked up about it, the more challenging. I apologize.
It's
The more
okay.
challenging it becomes to maintain that situational awareness without losing some of the fundamental and basics of the skill sets, such as flying planes per se. No, we have to be quiet.
Jerry, we talked
I'm
about
sorry.
this. We
No
talked
worries,
about
Sorin.
this in automation. So it's which pieces does a computer or some other form of automation take over, and which pieces are left as still part of the human. And we never got into it in detail, but this is one of the issues with partly self-driving cars, for example, is the partly self-driving is much more sinister than fully self-driving or fully manually driven.
Pardon me for a second. Let me see if I can let them out a little bit so we can have a little peaceful conversation. There you go. Go play.
See you, doggies.
Continue.
They wanted to jump in and discuss the construct of autonomous aviation.
Oh, obviously that's a hot topic right now. By the way, is this working out for you guys?
Looks great.
Perfectly fine.
We've had over time we've had a decrease in the number of pilots in the flight deck. I remember some of the earliest Soviet-built airplanes would require something as many as maybe 8 or 9 crew members, starting from the actual 2 pilots up front to flight engineers to all kinds of other engineering duties. There's one particular airplane that I'm thinking about that had the requirement for someone to continuously walk in and out of the wing structure to lubricate various things that were moving. So from that,
hold on. Can you repeat exactly what you just said again? Somebody walking in and out of the wing structure in flight.
Inside, and I wish I could think off the top of my head of the actual aircraft that required certain technicians to walk in and out and apply lubricant to moving parts to make sure that the they weren't seizing, as for example little bells and cranks that would move about and would require, for example, lubrication. That was the duty of that particular technician. So much so that a particular crew would require a number of those technicians to walk up and down, in and out of certain crevices and places in the wing where they would have to lubricate those things. Nowadays, that's no longer the case. We operate generally with 2 crew members, and now the talk is that they might even consider moving to a 1 crew type of complement, if that makes sense.
Is that due to cost savings, or
I think that's the idea.
Because it's not as necessary?
There's 2 things. One is the cost savings, although that's probably not it, not the primary. The second one would be the elimination of the human error-making component. The idea, there's always been a challenge between of communication between the engineer and the pilot, so to speak. The engineer considers the pilot to be the primary source of errors.
Naturally.
Yes. The pilot considers the engineer to be the primary source of complexity. By the way, hello, say hi to Tucky. So there's always a challenge on how do you reconcile these two important components of the aviation human factor, so to speak.
So that what you just said makes me think of another question, because I remember reading The Right Stuff, which was sort of the golden era of flight, and I recently have been reading about motorcycle racers being moved from team to team due to complaints about their ride and the team's motorcycle not being up to snuff. And it makes me wonder, is one of the things that's changed in aviation the like is it, are pilots still very interested in being cool because they're flying? Is that vibe still there, or has things changed and it's now become a commoditized thing, and it's not quite as Top Gun as it used to be?
There's always that joke, and Terry, I probably said or verbalized it to you at some point. The joke is, how do you know that you're talking to a pilot? And the answer typically is just give him 5 minutes, he'll tell you. you know,
Yeah, the other version is don't worry, he'll let you know.
exactly. Yeah, and possibly even less than 5 minutes, right? So there's always a element of coolness about flying an airplane, primarily because it's something so special, something that requires a skill that is acquired over time. It's not something you can just basically teach somebody via a video and here you go, do
Hmm.
this. Um, but also because of the exclusivity. There's not that many pilots around there, so the exclusive nature of the endeavor makes it something of a cool thing. Now, I honestly think that the aviation has changed from its roots in that we know and we think more like a team than an individual. Individualism was, if you remember, the High and the Mighty, John Wayne being one of the co pilots there, and there's a scene where the captain chooses to take the airplane down right now, and the flight engineer is saying that they are not ready, that they need more time to prepare. And I believe John Wayne's character just turns around and smacks the captain into complying with the team concept, as opposed to just doing whatever he chooses to do right now, right there, if that makes sense. We've moved from that concept, from that mindset, to a more of a team. In fact, the common term used for this is CRM, the crew resource management, which first started as a cockpit resource management, and now has evolved into a concept that's used both in the operating rooms of hospitals, where the doctor is not God, but rather part of a team that accomplishes something together with the help and with the presence of everybody else involved, if that makes sense. Aviation has probably been the breeding ground for that concept, and today, what we do in aviation reflects that change in a major way compared to what it was a few decades back.
Soren, if now two, possibly one human pilots is the only thing standing between autonomously flying airplanes, what is it from a functionality standpoint that keeps the single human in the plane? Is there something that, from the airline's perspective, an expertise? Is there something from a functionality standpoint that the system might be prone to error? Is it a liability issue? What is it that keeps any human? It feels like aviation would be the place where you'd first see automated flights. What keeps a human in the cockpit?
I think the primary thing that makes it that keeps us from going into that direction at breakneck pace is contingency. Um, Anytime something goes wrong, there has to be a more direct way of intervening than, let's say, a latent signal that travels through space 5 minutes. Misconceptions about remote flying is that everything happens instantly. Well, it doesn't. I remember One of my friends who operated some of the military aircraft while based here stateside, the aircraft that they were operating was operating in other areas of the world. And one of the things that he said was you have to fly into the future. What you are doing now is something that happens a certain amount of time in the future. So you have to develop the skill to do that. Does that make sense?
It does.
Um, and that's where my point about contingency comes into play. Every large corporation has a department that deals specifically with that contingencies. What happens if? And I think the thing that keeps pilots and probably requires the pilots to stay in the cockpit for at least for a little while is this contingency. What happens when something doesn't work well? And I can think of a number of things. The aircraft that we currently have in the world operating from large to small don't have the capability to manage contingencies on their own. Are they getting better? The answer is yes. Have they gotten there? The answer is emphatically no.
Yeah, it feels like the same. It feels like the same scenario with. You could have very easily been describing fully autonomous cars there as well. It feels like the same. Maybe it's a little more nuanced for cars because I don't think you can ever account for all of the potential scenarios that a car will come into. The algorithms can't prepare for that, but it feels like you would be able to correct for that more easily in an aircraft.
There's also no way you're not having a trained operator who can be trained in contingency management for a car. Unless we're going to change everything about how people drive, and you now have someone who is, there's no CRM equivalent in a car. It's just I get in the car and I operate the vehicle. So if you adjust all of the training and all of the human resources around how you look at managing that machinery, if you can do that when you have trained pilots or trained ship operators, ship captains or something like that, and then you can blend the captain or the operator will always know these are the things that are done autonomously, these are not. The average person operating a personal vehicle has essentially zero training by comparison.
Yeah. Soren, what's the part of flight you feel like is going to be the most difficult long term to automate? Is it takeoff and landing?
No, we actually have. Well, I shouldn't say that. We have most of the large aircraft that we operate today have the capability to so-called autoland. Uh, yeah, it's not as simple as it sounds. You don't just push a button and boom, the thing autolands. There are some attempts at certifying aircraft that have that capability, and that's a contingency for, let's say, a pilot failure or a health condition of some sort that forces the pilot out of the equation. Um, but yes, we do have, for example, in very low weather conditions, there is a procedural uh, series of steps where we autoland these airplanes but there's certain signals that have to be there, radio transmissions from particular aligning tools that are present on the ground. We do that regularly. We don't do that as a matter of every day, but it is available when the situation becomes dire enough. The weather conditions are, the low visibility is such that you wouldn't be able to see. You can land, but there are limitations. For example, the maximum components of crosswind or headwind or tailwind must be met. You must be below those. So it can't, in other words, the contingency has been built in such a way that as long as you meet certain conditions, and I can't go through all of them right now, the autoland can happen. Having those conditions made every time for every flight to occur, that's where the autonomous flight has to resolve. That's what it has to resolve first, if that makes sense. And it's impossible right now, I think, to do so reliably every time, anytime.
Is it ever disorienting to have a combination of what's amazingly possible and very far future feeling versus things that are the same as they've ever been for your entire career?
Absolutely, it is. It's very confusing, and it's also a challenge to the training departments of certain of all the airlines how to integrate what's available with what the pilot population can absorb, because there are certain
Interesting.
features of our aircraft which are not used as a matter of daily routine simply because they haven't been integrated in the community. So you live. It's one. I wish I could draw this out, but there's that concept of the generic circle, and yes, there's ways to operate at the edges of the circle, but you really want the majority of your technical population to live within the center of it, where it's safest and least trouble-free, if that makes sense. So that's what happens in the pilot populations of these various airlines too. Not every single technical capability of the aircraft is exploited every day, because it's simply not trained. It's probably impossible to train everybody perfectly. You probably live at the lowest common denominator of that particular population, which may be pretty high, but it's still the lowest common denominator of training, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So let's maybe switch gears a bit. Fascinating bit of conversation there. You moved to Louisville, as I understand it, Sorin. You moved to Louisville to go to seminary school. Is that correct?
I did, yes.
What led you to that? Actually, I understand what led you to that because I know a little bit about your background. So I'll save that step. But I'm more interested in if you could take us through, because we had a little bit of a discussion about a particular religious sect in one of our early podcasts that was an Anabaptist. The Hutterites, exactly. Yes. It was an Anabaptist sect, and I'm curious about how that particular branch of Protestantism, of the Christian religion, how common it is in Romania. And can you tell us a little bit about how the Baptist denomination per se, how it got its hold in Romania and how it became a religion that you were familiar with before you came to the States?
Well, it's not as common. It is to a very literal sense of the word, the minority. In fact, because of the multiple segments of the so-called neo-Protestant religious organizations, they themselves contribute to the status of minority because there's not that much interaction. For example, there's Pentecostals, there's Baptists, there's so-called Christian Brethren, and a number of others, which I don't intentionally want to miss them, so I don't want to offend their sensibilities by not mentioning their names. I just can't remember them right now all. But it represents, they all represent a small number relative to the whole population. Obviously, traditionally, those areas of the world belong to a very powerful religious tradition, such as the Orthodox Church, or if you go farther west, you're looking at the Catholic Church, and then the Reformed churches in Europe. They constitute a little bit of a higher percentage of the population, so to speak. The smaller groups, Baptists, Pentecostals, and so on, they represent minorities right now. Unlike the United States, where this concept of freedom of religion is so intrinsic to everyday life that you find more people in the Protestant denominations versus probably the more classical ones, if that makes sense. I think it's an expression of, and I haven't researched the subject, I'm just speaking off my head. I think it's a reflection of the society as a whole and how it tolerates the concept of freedom and liberty of thought, that you have a much higher percentage of Protestantism in the West generally and the U.S. particularly than you have it in other more traditional areas of the world, such as Central Europe, for example. I don't know, we probably got off topic, so I probably lost the initial train of thought.
No. You're right on topic. What led you? What was your interest in Romania? What was your interest in attending seminary in the States?
Let me say something that probably is when you think of all the great names in historical culture, go to people such as Leonardo da Vinci, or um, even the classical people, Cicero, Plato, Aristotle, and so on. There was always an element of complexity in all the endeavors that they've engaged in. For example, you would find a focus on letters, on humanities, on technical social development, on mathematics, and you would find all of those in the same person. So, to a certain degree, um, I think it's part of the human curiosity to explore all these areas of life. I certainly suffered from that, if that makes sense. It's an affliction because it makes you perhaps be less focused in certain areas that perhaps may be financially rewarding. But the variety of interests is part of my DNA, I should say. I like to do math. I like to understand physics. I've made my initial living in the United States working on cars. I love reading a book on topics of philosophy, for example. So I guess my presence in the United States was a confluence of, or coming to school in the US was a confluence of both the variety of interests and the possibility of it at that time, which was not really something that was possible before the revolution in 1989 for them.
Are you
So,
still as curious now as you were then?
sorry?
Are you still as curious now as
Oh
you were
God,
then?
yes. I just had a this morning. Yesterday there was an issue that happened to one of the aircraft that we operate. This is not related to work. This is related to a private interest that we have with a couple of other colleagues. And this malfunction happened kind of like a surprise. And this morning, we spent the entire time trying to understand what happened and why. And obviously, we want to fix it. And it turns out that it's really not that big of a deal. But it was important for us, for both of us, to understand why did it happen? Why is it? Why is what we're seeing happening the way it is? And that's, I think, an expression of curiosity.
Well, we
I just got
determined.
home. Literally, I was when Terry was telling me to prepare for logging in. I told him, I said, I'm on my way. I'm almost home. I will be there, and I'll look at it momentarily. I was coming back from that, Terry.
Well, we determined on one of our first shows that intellectual curiosity is a human superpower. So we're glad to see that you still have that.
Well, thank you. I'm getting old, and probably less and less vexed at that. But
Do you get frustrated if you can't get to the bottom of
oh
something?
God, yes. Yeah,
How does that manfest?
it
How does it
keeps you
actually
up
come out?
at night.
How do the people around you feel about it
I'm
when you're
sorry.
in that space?
Say that again.
How do the people around you feel about you when you're in
Oh,
that
they get
space
very
where you're
frustrated.
frustrated by a thing you can't?
Sometimes people say, "Okay, well, let's leave him, let him be, because he's just right now is in that zone."
Yeah. What does stoicism mean to you, Soren?
God, you're making me reach into my old library of thought. What does it really mean? Just recently, our vet used the term stoicism to describe this latest puppy that we adopted. She's old. She's a 8, 9 year old abandoned mother. I think she was used for breeding. And when we took her there, the word that the doctor used was stoic. It's a stoic brand. It's a stoic breed. It's a pit bull. Now she's an older lady, so we don't really have speaking of I think she thinks that I'm talking about her. But she described this vet described the breed as stoic, and what I think she meant by it, or at least the way I interpret it, which is the way I look at stoicism, is a breed which withstands, which tolerates pain, uh, continues living in spite of challenges, um, continues barking in spite of being told not to. But that's what Stoicism seems to be from a practical standpoint. Theoretically, it's probably. Are you trying to tell me what Stoicism is? Yes, yes, yes. It's probably sticking to something, a set of values, a set of decisions. By the way, is this bothering you guys? Yes.
No, we can still hear you. Okay.
Okay, so it's basically standing by a set of established values and decisions at pretty high cost. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm interested. Do you find um obviously the Bible is and Christianity is
Let me move the menu. Let's see if that changes a little bit the discourse. I'm sorry. I'm going to continue.
sure. No, I was just going to say the big one of the big themes what are one or two of the big themes of the Bible of Christianity that you take that one, the equivalent of a Stoic and not necessarily ideologically equivalent, but what are one or two of the big themes of the Bible or Christianity that you find valuable in your day-to-day life?
I have to resort to the basic the condensed version of the law as described by Jesus when he was challenged in one of those instances where they were trying to catch him at his word. And to me, uh, the the two items that he mentions are probably what what you described for me, which is love your God and love your neighbor as yourself. Essentially live your life with that consideration, with that thought. And I think from there, all the things that you and I consider as normal good living derive from that. As long as you behave with good intentions and good loving attitude towards both God and your neighbor, everything else flows from there. Make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it's some would say those that love your neighbor as yourself and love God with all your heart, that those are the purest intentions of the Bible.
I have a thought on that, and forgive me for interrupting you, but
No.
sometimes love is misunderstood as meaning strictly one thing, and it doesn't. Obviously, we know in our normal conversations about what tough love means. Any parent that has raised children knows that sometimes loving them means making them do things that they don't necessarily like. Loving them doesn't mean liking involved in the process. Make sense? So I don't want to allow the misconception that, oh my gosh, we just have to love and love and love peace and everything. Okay, great, but then that causes societies to descend into chaos.
So not all cotton candy. There has to
No,
be some broccoli in there as well, huh?
we got sometimes a little bit of a thorny. I I actually had not that I've gotten a beating or physical corporal punishment that much in my growing up years, But one time I got one of those, what's the word in English? One of those. It's like you go up to the tree and cut a little
Switch.
switch. There you go. That's exactly what I was looking
Fetch me
for.
a
But
switch.
it had a couple of thorns on it, and that was actually very, very, very unpleasant. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah, that I don't know if that's an old school hillbilly tradition, but
Well,
I think
I'm an old school. What can I say?
my mom. Well, I was going to say my mom. I think I didn't get it very much. I didn't get that very much as a child either. But I think once or twice my mom made me go pick my own weapon of war.
The switch.
Yeah, I wasn't a fan of that.
which child is?
Yeah,
It's very ritualistic. The process of you've done something wrong, you've been caught, you have your comeuppance. The intention is not to hit a child. The intention is to cause reflection and to instill a certain sense of dread of the impending punishment. And
Precisely.
the
It's
dread
causing
comes with reflection.
it's the methodology of teaching cause and effect. Sometimes the effect of a bad action doesn't necessarily present itself right away. You only will see the results much later and possibly at the most inopportune time. Well, the only way for a child, tabula rasa, clean mind, like a child, to learn that principle is to have a little bit of the bad effects need to be more proximate to the action itself. If that makes sense.
I'm just very grateful that you brought in the term tabula rasa to this conversation, to our podcast. So that is a not very common term that I appreciate.
That's John Locke right there, man.
That's John Locke, huh?
Yeah, I think so. If my memory serves me correctly.
So I have I know we're probably getting close to time, but I have a question. We have probably a few more questions, but I have a question, and this is a weird one, but it's something that I think about a lot. So the olfactory is one of the strongest connections to memory. Obviously, sound is as well, but the smells are and especially for me, trigger memories of youth and childhood.
And
Are
rightly
there
so.
are there any smells or scents that you get that make you think of Romania?
Oh God, yes. Particularly my mom's cooking. Something of a side note on this. I had a good friend who he is a TMJ specialist. He was a medical doctor with obviously a dentistry and so on. He taught, I think, at University of Georgia for a while. But one of the things he taught me in our conversation was that the olfactory sensory system is the very first to form. And I may be wrong on this one. I'm probably just repeating what he told me. So because it is one of the earliest developmental stages of a being of any sort, humans in general, it usually forces olfactory senses to be the most vivid memory. And that's why I think we are overcome by memories associated with senses of smell. I love my mom's cooking. I despise certain smells in very bad areas of town, and I think when you see those, when you experience those, uh, you will have memories that come rushing to your foreground, so to speak.
Yeah.
So it's
Any
natural that you actually have very powerful memories associated with the smells.
Any particular herb or spice in your mother's cooking that is a strike for you?
Yes, and let me think of the name of it in English. She actually she has a little crop of it still happening naturally in her garden. I think it's called thyme. I may be mistaken, but thyme. She actually sells. There's a certain dish in those areas of the world called sarmale, which is actually an Ottoman-derived Turkish term, but most of the places around there call them that way. You would know those as pigs in a blanket or normally cabbage rolls, things of that sort. And one of the ingredients that she puts in there is thyme. And every time I smell it, it's as if I'm having one of those things in front of me every time.
Very cool.
So, yeah.
Russ, you want to take us out?
I wish I'm picturing Sorin's interesting life in smells. And I'm picturing smells from air shows as a small child. I'm picturing smells of flight lines. I'm picturing smells of international travel, smells of mom's cooking, all of these things all together. So congratulations, Terry. You've got me to imagine the most interesting man in Kentucky in terms of smell.
You guys are buttering me up way beyond my deserving it.
I'm smelling the new pit bull, the new old pit bull. I got it all.
He's such a good soul.
The new old pit bull.
Yeah,
such a good soul.
Awesome. Well, Sorin, ton of fun. A million things, little detours in philosophy that I think we would like to have you back to discuss further. And we may, as we have automation discussions, want to get your take on automation with respect to airplanes, because I think that was a really interesting discussion compared to a lot of what we talk or in line of with a lot of what we talk about. So ton of thanks. Enjoyed it.
No, thank you for having me. I'm humbled by the fact that you guys considered somebody like me to be worthy enough to be invited on your show, and I find that I'm honored, and thank you.
Well, you classed up the joint, so no need to thank us. We'd be making fun of someone's song lyrics or auto tune or some trivial topic like that if we hadn't had this discussion.
Distinctly possible we would have been arguing about Locke also.
Should we find ourselves into this conversation again? If you give me the guardrails, we'll stay on the topic, because there's so many things to be talking about Europe in general. One of the fascinating books that I've just finished reading, it's a book that came about 10 years ago. But one of the historians that in the aftermath of the World War II, he studied it closely. It's called Savage Continent. We probably discussed that at some point, maybe. But it is something that I highly recommend reading. It exposes, or it presents, probably the human nature in its rawest and nastiest form in those times. And it's very difficult for people, even in those areas of the world, to imagine that people could really have behaved that way. But they did, nevertheless. So...
Well, I made the point to Russ yesterday that I constantly think about, especially recently, we're one power grid failure away from those times returning. Like, I think this whole thing's held together. It's so fragile. And I don't think we're that far removed from those types of things making their way back into societies.
I think that you're right. I think you're right.
Yeah. Anyway, great way to end a conversation. Talking about the return of savagery. Savagery.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Sorin. Awesome. Talk to you again soon.
I appreciate it.
Have a good day. Thanks, Sorin.